Buckle up, everyone, because we're diving into some serious political territory today. President-elect Trump's pick for National Security Advisor is raising eyebrows and sparking a whole lot of debate. Yeah, we're talking about retired Army Green Beret and Congressman Mike Waltz. If you're into military strategy, global power plays, or just can't resist a good political drama, then hit that like button, subscribe, and tell your friends about the channel. We're going to break down what this appointment could mean for the U.S. military, our relationship with China, and even the ongoing war in Ukraine. We've got some fascinating articles here from Reuters, and we're going to pull out all the juiciest details for you.
It's definitely a choice that signals a potential shift in U.S. foreign policy.
So before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's start with the basics. Who exactly is Mike Waltz? I mean, we know he's a Green Beret, but what else should we know about his background?
Well, his resume is pretty impressive. Beyond his military service, Waltz has built a pretty significant career in politics. He's been a Republican congressman representing Florida since 2018, and right now he's the chair of the House Armed Services Subcommittee on Military Logistics. Oh, and he also sits on the House Intelligence Committee. And he's a key player in the Republicans' China task force.
Wow. Okay, so this isn't just some symbolic appointment. This guy's got some serious experience in shaping national security policy.
Absolutely. And it's pretty clear that he's been thinking deeply about these issues for a long time. He even wrote a whole book on strategy. It's called Hard Truths: Think and Lead Like a Green Beret.
So he's not just a man of action. He's a strategist, too. And from what I've heard, he's never been one to shy away from voicing his opinions, especially when it comes to China and how the Biden administration handled the situation in Afghanistan.
You could say that again. When it comes to China, Waltz is what some might call a China hawk. He sees China as the biggest threat facing the U.S. right now. And he's a strong advocate for a powerful U.S. military presence in the Indo-Pacific region.
The Indo-Pacific region?
Yeah, that's the area covering both the Indian and Pacific Oceans.
Got it. And you said his strategy for dealing with China is aggressive.
Yeah. I mean, he wants to speed up the process of arming Taiwan, reassure our allies in the Pacific, and modernize all of our military equipment. He's been a really vocal critic of how he sees the Biden administration handling things with China.
Interesting. And it seems like his views on this line up pretty closely with Trump's, especially considering he's a known Trump loyalist. He even showed up at Trump's hush money court hearing earlier this year. But let's flip the coin for a second. What are Waltz's critics saying about this appointment?
Well, there are definitely some voices of concern out there. One of the main things they're pointing to is his involvement with a conservative movement that's against teaching certain things about racism in the military. It's been a pretty controversial issue. He's also really big on firing generals and civilian bureaucrats who aren't performing up to par. That could definitely make him a divisive figure at the Pentagon.
So he's not afraid to shake things up. Now, given his military background, I'm really curious about his stance on the war in Ukraine. Is he totally on board with providing support?
It's not quite that black and white. While he was initially in favor of sending weapons to Ukraine, he's recently started calling for the U.S. to reassess its goals there.
What made him change his tune?
Well, he's expressed some worries about how much it's costing us to support Ukraine over the long haul, and whether it's preventing us from focusing on what he sees as the primary threat: China.
So he's thinking about the bigger picture and the potential downsides.
Exactly. And when it comes to NATO, he's supportive of the alliance. But he also believes that our allies need to step up and spend more on their own defense, which actually aligns with criticisms Trump has made in the past about NATO members not pulling their weight.
Okay, so we're seeing some consistent themes here. A really strong emphasis on China, a more cautious approach to Ukraine, and a push for NATO allies to increase their defense budgets. These could all be pretty big shifts in U.S. foreign policy. But what about the impact on the U.S. military itself? I mean, Waltz has been pretty critical of the Pentagon in the past, right?
Oh, yeah, he definitely has. He sees a lack of accountability within the Pentagon, and he's called for firing generals and civilian bureaucrats who just aren't getting the job done. He's even gone so far as to introduce legislation to audit what he calls unnecessary and political DEI programs in the military.
Hold on. DEI programs, you mean diversity, equity, and inclusion? What's this problem with those?
His argument is that these programs are sometimes driven by political agendas rather than actually making the military stronger. He's all about meritocracy. He wants to see what he calls a restoration of a merit-based culture in the armed forces.
So there could be a major culture clash brewing inside the Pentagon.
It's definitely a possibility. He's also voiced concerns about what he calls political correctness in the military, which can mean a whole range of things, from what's being taught at West Point to how certain policies are implemented. It'll be interesting to see how this all unfolds.
It definitely will. Sounds like we've got a lot to unpack here. This appointment could have some major ripple effects across the military and the world. But we'll dive deeper into all that in just a bit, so don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after a quick break.
It's going to be interesting to see what happens.
Okay, so we've established that Waltz is definitely a China hawk. But what does that actually mean in terms of concrete actions? What could we see the U.S. doing differently under his guidance as National Security Advisor?
Well, one of the most likely outcomes is a significant increase in military deployments to the Indo-Pacific. Sending more ships, more troops, more firepower to the region. That would send a clear signal to China that the U.S. is serious about maintaining its presence and its influence in the area.
And what about our allies in the region? Places like Japan, South Korea, Australia.
Waltz has been really vocal about the importance of strengthening those alliances. He sees them as absolutely crucial to containing China's ambitions. So he's likely to push for more military cooperation, more joint exercises, maybe even sending additional U.S. troops to those countries.
But wouldn't that just escalate tensions with China? I mean, they've already made it clear they're not happy about U.S. military activity in the region.
Oh, absolutely. China sees the Indo-Pacific as their own backyard, and they're not going to welcome what they see as the U.S. stepping on their toes.
And what about Taiwan? Waltz has been advocating for arming them more quickly, right?
Right. He believes that a well-armed Taiwan would act as a deterrent to any potential aggression from China. His argument is that the U.S. needs to give Taiwan the weapons it needs to defend itself, and make it crystal clear to China that any attempt to take Taiwan by force would have serious consequences.
But wouldn't that just make things worse? Couldn't that provoke a military conflict?
It's definitely a risk, and one that policymakers are going to have to weigh very carefully. But Waltz's view is that a strong deterrent posture is the best way to prevent war. He thinks that showing weakness only invites aggression, and that the U.S. needs to project an image of strength and resolve to keep China in check.
So this is all starting to sound very complicated and potentially dangerous. Is there any way to balance all these competing interests without risking a major conflict?
That is the million-dollar question. And unfortunately, there are no easy answers. Diplomacy is going to be essential, but it has to be backed up by a credible military deterrent. Waltz's position is that the U.S. needs to maintain a strong military presence in the region and be ready to use force if necessary.
So he's essentially advocating for peace through strength.
Exactly. He believes that the best way to preserve peace is to make it absolutely clear to any potential adversaries that the costs of aggression would be too high.
That's a pretty tough stance. And I imagine it's going to stir up some controversy both here in the U.S. and internationally.
It definitely will. But it reflects Waltz's worldview. He's a realist. He believes that power is what ultimately determines how things play out in international relations. And he's convinced that the U.S. needs to be willing to use its power to defend its interests.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential impact on China, but let's shift gears for a minute and talk about the war in Ukraine. How might Waltz's appointment affect U.S. involvement there?
That's a really important question, because Waltz's focus on China could lead to the U.S. shifting its priorities away from Europe. He's already expressed concerns about how much we're spending on supporting Ukraine, and he's argued that the U.S. needs to prioritize the challenge posed by China.
So does that mean we could see a decrease in U.S. military and financial aid to Ukraine?
It's possible. Waltz has called for the U.S. to reassess its objectives in Ukraine, and he's likely to advocate for a more limited U.S. role in the conflict. He thinks the U.S. should focus on giving Ukraine the weapons it needs to defend itself, but avoid getting dragged into a long and drawn-out war with Russia.
But wouldn't that upset our European allies? I mean, they've been heavily involved in supporting Ukraine.
It could definitely create some friction, but Waltz's argument is that the U.S. can't be expected to intervene in every conflict around the world. He believes the U.S. needs to be more selective in its commitments and focus on those that are truly vital to its national interests.
So basically, he's arguing for a more restrained foreign policy,
True.
One that's less interventionist and more focused on core national security goals.
Exactly. He believes the U.S. needs to be more strategic in how it uses its military power and avoid getting caught up in conflicts that don't directly threaten its interests.
That's a pretty big change from the more interventionist approach that's been the norm in U.S. foreign policy for decades.
It is. It reflects Waltz's belief that the U.S. needs to adapt to a changing world order, one where it can't afford to be the world's policeman anymore.
So it sounds like Waltz's appointment could signal a major shift in U.S. foreign policy, with a greater emphasis on competition with China and a more hands-off approach to conflicts in other parts of the world.
That's a pretty accurate summary. And those changes are likely to have a significant impact on the global balance of power.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy how one person getting a new job can cause so many waves internationally.
It really shows you how connected everything is in the world these days.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about how this could affect China, Europe, even the U.S. military itself. But what does it all mean for the everyday American? What should people be paying attention to?
I think the main thing to understand here is that the world is becoming more and more multipolar. It's not like the Cold War anymore, where it was basically just us and our allies against one big enemy like the Soviet Union.
So we're moving away from that kind of simple us versus them view of the world.
Exactly. We're seeing new global powerhouses emerging like China and India. And older regional powers are flexing their muscles again like Russia and Iran. It all adds up to a much more complicated and unpredictable situation on the world stage.
So how does that affect the U.S.?
Well, it means we can't just call the shots like we may be used to. We have to deal with a whole bunch of different players now, each with their own goals and ideas.
So does that mean the U.S. needs to rethink its whole approach to foreign policy?
I think it's pretty clear that the old ways of doing things might not work anymore. We can't be everywhere trying to solve every problem. We need to be smarter about picking our battles and focusing our energy.
And is that what Waltz is suggesting?
It seems like it. He's all about putting America's interests first and dealing with what he sees as the biggest threats head on, especially China. He's also not a huge fan of working through big international groups. He prefers a more go-it-alone approach.
But isn't that kind of risky? Could that make our allies mad and end up making the U.S. less safe?
It's a gamble, for sure.
Yeah.
There are definitely legitimate concerns about what could happen if the U.S. becomes more isolated.
So what's the alternative? Is there some way to balance looking out for ourselves with the need to cooperate with other countries?
That's the big question facing U.S. leaders right now, and there are no easy answers. It's going to take some serious diplomacy, strategic thinking, and being willing to work with other countries, even when we don't always agree.
It sounds like we're heading into a pretty uncertain and complicated time for global affairs.
I think that's a fair assessment. A lot of the old rules don't apply anymore, and it's hard to say what's going to happen next.
So what should we be keeping an eye on? What are the signs that'll tell us where things are headed?
I think it's going to be really important to watch how the U.S. interacts with China in the next few years. Will the trade war keep going? Will there be military clashes in the South China Sea?
And what about Europe? Will we see the U.S. start to distance itself from its traditional allies there?
That's another big question, Durach. If Waltz's ideas win out, we could see the U.S. reduce its military presence in Europe and expect NATO countries to take on more responsibility for their own defense.
And what about things here at home? How could Waltz's appointment affect the political climate in the U.S.?
Well, it could definitely make the political divide even deeper, especially on issues like how much we spend on the military and when it's appropriate to use military force.
It sounds like there's a lot riding on all this.
Absolutely. It's going to be fascinating to see how it all plays out.
Well, folks, we've covered a lot of ground today exploring what Mike Waltz becoming Trump's national security advisor could mean.
We've talked about the possibility of increased tension with China, a more restrained U.S. foreign policy, and even potential clashes within the Pentagon itself.
We hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought.
And if you enjoyed it, please give this video a like, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment below letting us know what you think.
We always appreciate hearing from you. And until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and most importantly, stay informed.